May 5th, 1993. A quiet Wednesday afternoon in the small city of West Memphis, Arkansas. Three boys, 8-year-old Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, didn't come home for dinner. They had been out riding their bikes like so many afternoons before. It was a warm spring day, and the sun had already begun to dip behind the flat Mississippi horizon. Their parents, first worried, then frantic, began scouring their neighborhood. Police were notified around 8 p.m. Searches began immediately. Neighbors combed the streets. Flashlights lit up ditches and storm drains. But there was no sign of the boys. That night, West Memphis was unsettled. An eerie quiet fell over the suburban streets, one that would never quite lift again. The next day, what started as a missing persons case would evolve into something darker, something that would haunt the American legal system for decades. The story of the West Memphis Three isn't just about murder. It's about fear, about judgment, about how justice can bend when belief outweighs evidence. This is the story of 3 victims and 3 more accused. On May 6th, 1993, just a day after the boys were last seen, a grim discovery was made. Robin Hood Hills, a patch of dense woods near the Blue Beacon truck wash, became the focal point of search. Around 1:45 p.m., a juvenile parole officer spotted a black shoe floating in a shallow, muddy drainage ditch. When he waded in, he found more than just clothing. The bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were discovered submerged in a muddy creek. They had been stripped naked. Their wrists were bound to their ankles with shoelaces. Their bodies bore injuries. One, in particular, Christopher Byers, had sustained more severe mutilation. The water had washed away much evidence. There were no weapons, no footprints, no eyewitnesses. But the nature of the scene and the children's age triggered instant shock and horror. Almost immediately, whispers of a satanic ritual began to circulate. After all, it was the early 1990s. America was in the throes of the so-called satanic panic, a cultural phenomenon where the fear of ritual abuse, cults, and devil worship saturated media and public discourse. Before forensics could do its work, the court of public opinion had already reached its verdict. 3 children had been murdered, and the city wanted someone to blame. West Memphis, Arkansas, in 1993 was not a large city. With just over 27,000 residents, it was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where families stayed for generations, and where outsiders stood out. It also sat on the western edge of the Mississippi River, directly across from Memphis, Tennessee. Economically strained and religiously conservative, the town was deeply rooted in evangelical Christianity and traditional values. And like much of the country, it had absorbed the cultural paranoia of the time. By the early 1990s, America had been gripped by the satanic panic for nearly a decade. Talk shows like Geraldo aired dramatic episodes about hidden cults and devil-worshipping criminals. Police departments were trained to look for signs of ritual abuse. Daycares, churches, and youth centers had all been swept up in allegations, many unfounded, some wildly exaggerated. So when 3 8-year-old boys turned up murdered, stripped, and tied up in a wooded area, the implications were immediate and chilling. Rumors spread quickly. The wounds, though explainable through wildlife predation and possible blunt force trauma, were interpreted as signs of ritual mutilation. The bindings, shoelaces, were seen as deliberate, symbolic, sinister. And the woods where the boys were found, they became known as a place of alleged cult gatherings, though no credible evidence ever confirmed such claims. Local law enforcement, under intense pressure from a terrified public and media scrutiny, began looking not just for a murderer, but for a motive. And in the world they were living in, there was one explanation that made sense to them: Satanism. Damian Eccles was 18. Jason Baldwin was 16. Jesse Miskelly Jr. was 17. They lived in and around West Memphis. Poor, working-class teens with complicated home lives and reputations for being different. But in a place like West Memphis in 1993, being different could be dangerous. Damien stood out the most. He wore black. Read Stephen King and Aleister Crowley. Kept a journal of poetry. He was intelligent, but labeled a troublemaker. He'd been hospitalized previously for depression. In the eyes of his community, he was an outsider, and therefore a target. Jason Baldwin was Damien's close friend. Quiet, artistic, and mild-mannered. There was no criminal record, no history of violence. Just loyalty. He stood by Damien. Jesse Miskelly Jr. was from a neighboring area with an IQ in the low 70s and a reputation for being easily manipulated. He wasn't particularly close to the other two boys. He lived with his father and often worked odd jobs. Their names entered the case gradually, first through hearsay. A local teenager told police that Damien had expressed interest in the case. Another claimed Damien was involved in the occult. These weren't concrete leads, but they matched the narrative law enforcement was now pursuing. Damien, with his dark clothing and fascination with alternative spirituality, became the centerpiece of the investigation. And with little more than suspicion and fear, detectives brought Jesse Miskelly in for questioning. That decision would alter the lives of all three boys. On June 3rd, 1993, less than a month after the murders, police brought in Jesse Miskelly Jr. for questioning. He was 17 years old. His IQ was recorded at 72, borderline intellectually disabled. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have a parent or guardian with him. Over the next 12 hours, Jesse was interrogated by West Memphis police. Only 46 minutes of that interrogation were recorded. In the final tape portion, Jesse confessed. He told police that he had been with Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin when they murdered the three boys in Robin Hood Hills. He described acts of violence, claiming the victims had been sexually assaulted, tied up, and mutilated. His story included details that seemed to confirm the investigators' suspicions. But there were serious problems. Jesse's statements were riddled with contradictions. At one point, he claimed the murders happened in the morning, when school was still in session. He got names, times, and even a method of binding wrong. Investigators corrected him multiple times on tape, effectively feeding him the right answers. And Jesse would later recant. Multiple times. He said he was scared. He said he didn't understand what was happening. He said he told police what they wanted to hear because he thought he could go home. Despite this, his confession became the cornerstone of the case against all three teenagers. There was no physical evidence linking Damien, Jason, or Jesse to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. Just the confession. But in the eyes of law enforcement and a public desperate for resolution, that was enough. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Jesse Miskelly was tried separately in January 1994. The prosecution built its case almost entirely on his confession. Despite multiple inconsistencies and no supporting physical evidence, a jury found him guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. A month later, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin stood trial together. This time, the confession could not be used. Jesse had refused to testify against them. Still, prosecutors pressed forward, relying on the same narrative, that the murders were the result of a satanic ritual carried out by teenagers obsessed with the occult. The prosecution brought in a so-called occult expert who testified that the murder scene had all the hallmarks of a ritual killing. His qualifications were thin. He had taken a mail-order course in cult crime. Nevertheless, the testimony stuck. The defense struggled. They had little time, limited resources, and were facing a deeply biased public. The trial became more about who Damien was than what he did. He wrote poetry. He wore black. He listened to Metallica. That became the evidence. On March 18, 1994, Damien Echols was sentenced to death. Jason Baldwin was given life without parole. They were 18 and 17 years old. Across Arkansas, many saw justice served, but others, quietly at first, began to question what had just happened. With the trials concluded, the gavel came down on the fate of 3 teenagers. Damien Echols, at just 18, was sent to death row, housed in solitary confinement at the Varner Unit Supermax facility in Arkansas. His appeals process began immediately, but the odds were stacked against him. Jason Baldwin, 17 at the time of his conviction, was sent to a maximum security prison to serve life without the possibility of parole. In interviews later, Baldwin would say he had been offered a deal, testify against Damien and receive a reduced sentence. He refused. Jesse Miskelly, the first to be convicted, began his sentence with little understanding of what had truly happened in court. He, too, would continue to appeal. For the families of the murdered boys, the verdicts were both a form of closure and a continued source of pain. Not everyone was convinced justice had been served, but the legal system had spoken. Yet troubling questions lingered beneath the surface. There was still no physical evidence tying the three teenagers to the crime scene. The confession had been deeply flawed. The so-called expert testimony on Satanism was subjective and speculative. Key witnesses were inconsistent or later recanted altogether. And a larger question loomed. If they didn't do it, who did? As the years passed, those doubts would grow louder. Voices would emerge from behind cameras, inside law libraries, and across the nation, challenging what had once seemed like an open and shut case. The West Memphis Three were behind bars, but the story was far from over. In 1996, 3 years after the convictions, a film aired on HBO that would reignite national attention. Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, wasn't meant to make a statement. The filmmakers originally planned to document the story of 3 teenagers convicted of killing children in a small southern town. But what they uncovered changed everything. The documentary revealed the inconsistencies in the case. It aired footage of Jesse Miskelly's interrogation. It highlighted the absence of physical evidence. It explored the use of character and appearance as prosecution tools. And it brought viewers into the courtroom to see firsthand how emotion and fear shaped the trial. Paradise Lost prompted a wave of reconsideration. Viewers began asking, did the system get wrong? Public interest grew. Celebrities took notice. Musician Eddie Vedder, filmmaker Peter Jackson, actor Johnny Depp, and author Margaret Cho became vocal supporters of the West Memphis Three. The case inspired fundraisers, rallies, and legal funds. People wanted answers and action. Meanwhile, behind bars, Damien, Jason, and Jesse continued their appeals. Their supporters pushed for DNA testing, a new frontier in criminal justice that hadn't been used in the original investigation. The movement wasn't just about 3 young men anymore. It had become a symbol of how fragile justice can be when built on weak evidence, faulty assumptions, and social fear. And the momentum for Second Look was only just beginning. For years, the legal appeals of the West Memphis Three moved slowly. But in the background, something far more powerful than public opinion was evolving: science. In 2007, after more than a decade of imprisonment, new forensic testing was conducted on evidence from the crime scene. Technological advancements now allowed investigators to test previously untouched materials for trace DNA. The results were striking. No DNA from Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly was found on any of the victims' clothing, bindings, or at the scene. But a hair was discovered, tangled in one of the shoelaces used to bind the boys. That hair did not match any of the 3 defendants. Instead, it bore a consistent mitochondrial DNA match with Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of victim Stevie Branch. Another hair, found on a tree stump near the crime scene, was consistent with a friend of Hobbs. These revelations did not prove Terry Hobbs committed the crime. Mitochondrial DNA is not unique to individuals, and the area was not sealed off in 1993. But the findings raised serious doubts. Why had Hobbs never been investigated? Why had law enforcement failed to follow up on other leads? Alongside these forensic developments came new witness affidavits. One of Hobbs's family members claimed he had been seen with the boys on the evening they disappeared. Neighbors spoke of inconsistencies in his statements. None of this led to a new trial, but the walls were beginning to shift. Arkansas prosecutors now faced a public relations dilemma: continue to defend the original case or revisit a conviction that was looking increasingly unstable. Behind bars, Damien Echols, still on death row, watched the clock. Legal deadlines loomed. Appeals were narrowing. And although the tide was turning in their favor, time was running out. In August 2011, after 18 years behind bars, an unexpected resolution emerged. The state of Arkansas, facing growing scrutiny and a pending evidentiary hearing, proposed a deal. If Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly entered what is known as an Alford plea, they would be released. The Alford plea is a legal paradox. In it, a defendant maintains their innocence, but acknowledges that the state has enough evidence to potentially secure a conviction. The court accepts this as a guilty plea, without a full admission of guilt. To the West Memphis Three, it was both an opportunity and a burden. Damien Echols was facing imminent execution if appeals failed. Jason Baldwin, who had long said he would never admit guilt for a crime he didn't commit, reluctantly agreed to save Damien's life. Jesse Miskelly agreed as well. On August 19, 2011, the three men walked free. In a press conference outside the Craighead County Courthouse, Damien spoke softly to the gathered crowd. "We can still bring the truth to light," he said, but their release came at a cost. Legally, they were still convicted murderers. The original verdicts remained on the record. The state did not admit wrongdoing, and the families of the victims were left in a legal limbo, told that justice had been served, yet offered no closure. For supporters, it was a bittersweet victory. For critics of the justice system, it was a chilling example of how innocence does not guarantee exoneration. 18 years in prison. No compensación. No official apology. Just freedom, delivered through a loophole. After nearly 2 decades in prison, the West Memphis Three were free, but far from vindicated. Damien Echols, who had spent much of his time in solitary confinement on death row, relocated to New York. He wrote memoirs, began a new life, and continued speaking publicly about wrongful convictions. But the trauma of prison lingered. He has said he suffers from ongoing health issues and psychological scars. Jason Baldwin became an advocate for criminal justice reform. He earned his GED in prison and, after release, co-founded an organization to help other wrongfully convicted prisoners. He has remained vocal, but quiet in demeanor, never forgetting the cost of the plea. Jesse Miskelly retreated largely from the public eye. He rarely speaks to the media. Of the three, his post-prison life has been the most private and perhaps the most haunted. Meanwhile, the legal system moved on. No one else has ever been charged in connection with the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, or Christopher Byers. Terry Hobbs has denied any involvement. Law enforcement has not reopened the investigation. The case, in official terms, is closed. But for many, it remains one of the most troubling examples of flawed justice in modern American history. What happens when fear dictates the outcome of a trial? When appearance outweighs evidence? When a confession is extracted through pressure and confusion? The case of the West Memphis Three does not offer easy answers. It offers a warning. Justice, once compromised, is difficult to repair. And when the truth is uncertain, closure becomes elusive, not just for the convicted, but for everyone left behind. 3 boys were murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas. That much is certain. But everything that followed, 3 arrests, 3 convictions, and a lifetime of questions, remains a shadowy chapter in American criminal history. The West Memphis Three were freed, but not exonerated. The families of the victims still grieve, and the public remains divided. Did the justice system fail, or did it simply choose certainty over doubt? As time passes, the details fade, but the questions grow louder. Cases like this don't just challenge legal procedure. They challenge our belief in the system itself. Innocence isn't always enough. Evidence isn't always required. And justice, once lost, is not easily found again. So what do you think of today's video? Do you have something you want us to feature next? Tell us in the comments. It will also mean a lot to us if you like and subscribe. Close the book if you can. This is Black Chapter.